The latest round of US and Arab allies' airstrikes on jihadist positions in Syria targeted oil fields considered to be one of the main sources of funding for Islamic State. Small-scale refineries were targeted, with the Pentagon assessing the operation as being successful but not decisive. To talk more about this, we're joined live now by Ben Swan, investigative reporter. Ben, welcome. Talking in particular about those strikes. Now, Washington has said that it's been carried out, the aim being that these facilities, they remain largely intact, so they could be used in the future. I suppose what we're talking about is they're trying to disable them, but not necessarily destroy them. Is that possible, do you think, given the sort of weapons and the missiles that they're using?
I think it's very, very difficult, and I think most viewers would agree, very difficult to be able to target anything precisely through airstrikes. We refer to drone strikes as signature strikes, and yet we know drones wipe out a square block of space. So it's not a very definite signature. Look, whenever we talk about airstrikes, we're talking about very large swaths of lands and very imprecise strikes. I think it would be extremely difficult for the U.S. to be able to preserve oil fields while striking.
As we know, the refineries are currently controlled by Islamic State, but they belong to the nation. So by disabling them or destroying them, depending on the effect of these attacks, how big an effect is that going to have to the country long term?
Well, long term, I think it has a very strong effect. I heard someone say yesterday that the administration should just come out and say what they're trying to do, which is go ahead and launch strikes against Assad as well, because that's what they're really there for. What's fascinating, I think, about this kind of geopolitical battle here is that the U.S. has not sought nor received approval, along with coalition partners, to be in Syria conducting these strikes right now. It's a really fascinating kind of situation when you consider the president stood up in front of the UN General Assembly yesterday and he talked about the importance of rogue states not being able to just run roughshod over others and use the term might does not equal right. Well, in this case, I think might is trying to make right through this coalition of partners and the U.S. simply going into Syria and deciding they will conduct whatever war operations they choose to perform without even seeking the consent of the government.
Now, the Pentagon, they've been quite clear about it. They've come out and said that targeting these oil facilities is currently their top priority. But when you consider the growing number of refugees fleeing the country, the increasing number of villages that are being taken over, we hear about the atrocities being performed by the Islamic State militants. Does it surprise you that the US isn't looking at civilians as their number one priority?
Well, it really does not surprise me at all because, look, the U.S., and there's plenty on the record to demonstrate that the U.S., Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar have all been financing these rebel forces that have been turning over and defecting to ISIS. And they've been doing this in Syria for about 3 years. Over the last year, we've seen large numbers of defections to ISIS. The statement that you played previously, that quote from the Iranian president, I think rings true in that the U.S. should at least acknowledge its role in this, having done this. So as a result of that, if we're not even going to be honest about who has funded these groups, how they've received their weapons, and the fact that our president wants to continue to fight ISIS in Iraq and in Syria, but give additional money and weapons to the tune of $500 million, according to the U.S. Congress, to the Free Syrian Army, we're creating a perpetual state of war. We'll fund them on one side, and then we will attack them on the other. And the truth is that civilian casualties are just a part of the game at this point.
Now, we've talked about the attacks on refineries in Syria, but of course IS controls oil refineries in Iraq as well. Why is Washington not addressing those? Well,
and that's a great point. In fact, the numbers that come up that show that the Islamic State is worth about $2 billion right now, those estimates do not come from oil fields that they control in Syria, because right now those are somewhat useless to them because of the ongoing battle with the Syrian government. Instead, when you talk about those numbers, it is the Iraq-Mosul oil fields that are really deemed as being a valuable property to the Islamic State. And yet, as you pointed out a minute ago, the U.S. is not really conducting heavy airstrikes on those northern Iraqi oil fields. So it's why that is, I think we could all speculate, but at this point it would just be speculation.
So we have what is explained as being an attempt to stop the flow of income to Islamic State. We've also had this UN resolution which is described as being an attempt to stop the flow of the supply of people, of Europeans going to join their numbers. What do you think is the next step to try and stop Islamic State from the international community?
Well, again, look, this is why this story is so difficult to talk about, because when we talk about the flow of money, when we talk about the flow of people, there are enormous numbers of people here in the United States, I would say millions of them, who are fed up with the idea that the United States government is sending fighters and money to train these rebels who are then turning over and becoming ISIS fighters. Why are we going to create essentially sanctions against any country that sends fighters when we ourselves have been funding and supplying fighters? Senator Rand Paul has talked about this quite a bit here in the U.S., that the U.S. needs to step back and acknowledge the fact that we have funded these groups and given them technology, capability, money, and fighters in order to be able to become the Islamic State. How are we going to create sanctions against other countries that would be sending fighters? It is upside down town when we talk about this issue.
OK, been hearing the thoughts of investigative reporter Ben Swan joining us live from the US. Ben, thank you.